In 1938, a 9-year-old boy in the Kentucky Hollows walked 2 miles home through dark hardwood forest, using nothing but the stars above the canopy to find his direction. Nobody praised him for it. His mother looked up from the stove, told him to wash his hands, and went back to supper. That was Tuesday, in a world where competence was not admired. It was expected. Number 17 on this list was printed in every Boy Scout handbook in the country until 1972. It was quietly removed and reclassified as an advanced wilderness skill. Your grandfather learned it at age 8 by standing beside his father and watching. Number 4 was so fundamental to Great Depression households that families who could not do it were quietly regarded as unprepared for life. And number 3 is the skill that entire industries spent decades and billions of dollars making you forget. And they succeeded so thoroughly that most Americans today cannot perform it in an afternoon, with written instructions sitting right in front of them. These 25 things were not survival hobbies. They were not prepper fantasies or wilderness electives. They were the baseline of what a functional American child was expected to know before they were old enough to be left alone. The accumulated wisdom of 3 centuries of living without a grid, without a supply chain, without any system designed to catch you when you fell. We gave it all up in a single generation for convenience. And the people who sold us that convenience used the profit to build every system that now requires your permanent dependency to operate. Before we count down, understand one thing about the children who carried this knowledge. They were not remarkable. They were ordinary kids living ordinary lives in a world where the infrastructure we now consider essential had simply never been built. A child who did not know these things was considered as unprepared for life, as a child today who cannot read. The fact that we now find this knowledge remarkable tells you precisely how far and how fast we have drifted from the world our grandparents inhabited. Without a second thought. Number 25. Starting fire without manufactured tools. Every rural American child before 1950 knew at least 2 ways to produce fire without matches. The bow drill method generates friction heat between a dry hardwood spindle rotating against a notched softwood board until a coal forms in the groove below. That coal, transferred to a bundle of dried grass or cattail fluff, becomes flame with a single careful breath. Frontier families maintained this skill because matches were expensive, got wet, and ran out. The Civilian Conservation Corps trained tens of thousands of young men in this technique through the 1930s. It vanished from standard education when manufactured fire became cheap enough to take for granted. The wood has not changed. The physics have not changed. Only the person-to-person transmission of the knowledge has broken down completely. Number 24. Sharpening a blade to a working edge. A dull knife was considered a dangerous knife by every generation of Americans before the disposable culture arrived. The whetstone was as standard in a farm kitchen as a dinner plate. Children watched their fathers maintain blade edges in slow, consistent strokes, learning to judge the angle by touch rather than by a gauge or chart. A 12-year-old in 1935 could sharpen an axe before school without being asked. Today, most Americans either own tools they cannot maintain or replace them entirely when the edge fails. The knowledge is not complicated. An afternoon with the right teacher produces real results. The right teacher no longer exists in most American households. Number 23. Reading tomorrow's weather from the natural world. Your great-grandmother did not check a forecast before deciding whether to bring in the hay. She watched swallows, which fly high in rising barometric pressure and low in falling pressure, because the insects they chased do the same. She watched whether cattle had lain down before noon. She noted the number of rings around the moon, which are ice crystals in high cirrus clouds that precede a frontal system by 1 to 2 days. These were not superstitions. They were centuries of careful observation, condensed into practical rules, accurate enough to farm by. The knowledge transmitted person to person, through years of standing outside beside someone who explained what they were looking at while they looked at it. Number 22. Identifying edible wild plants by sight and season. A child walking any roadside or forest edge in 1890 could name and safely eat a dozen plants that most Americans today walk past without seeing. Lamb's quarters, richer in iron than beef. Wood sorrel, with its bright lemon flavor and significant vitamin C content. Cattail shoots in April, edible raw, and tasting of fresh cucumber. Ramps, the wild onion of Appalachia, harvested by the basketful each spring. This was not specialized knowledge. It was botanical literacy, transmitted through direct observation from parents who had learned the same way, adapted from indigenous peoples who had read this landscape for 10,000 years, before any European boot touched its soil. Today, most American adults cannot safely identify 3 wild edible plants in their own region. Number 21. Fishing without specialized equipment. Before the sporting goods industry made fishing equipment dependent, your grandfather fished with a cane pole cut from the creek bank, cotton line, a bent pin, and a worm from the garden compost. He did not need a tackle box. He needed to know where fish held on a summer afternoon, which was in the shade near the deep bend of the creek, close to any submerged log that offered cover. Approach the bank slowly, so your footsteps do not telegraph through ground into water. Drop the bait without splashing. These principles have not changed because fish have not changed. The bluegill hiding under the root ball in 1930 is hiding under one right now. What changed is that we convince ourselves finding it required $200 of gear. Number 20. Preserving meat without electricity or refrigeration. A hog butchered in November fed a frontier family. Through April, every child knew the 3 methods by heart. Smoking hung strips of venison or pork over hickory coals, held below 120 degrees for 8 to 12 hours, depositing antimicrobial compounds into the surface, while slowly drawing out interior moisture. Salt curing packed meat between generous layers of coarse salt in a wooden barrel, pulling water from the cells until bacteria could not survive the reduced water activity. A properly cured ham lasted 18 months in a root cellar without a single watt of electricity. Children participated in butchering day from the time they could carry a bucket. The work happened before dark. Every pair of hands counted, and nobody refused, because the alternative was going hungry through January. Number 19. Foraging and preparing medicinal herbs. The rafters of every Depression-era farmhouse hung thick with bundled drying herbs, each August and September. Yarrow, packed against bleeding wounds, worked through hemostatic compounds that modern wound care research has since confirmed. Elderberry syrup shortened fever duration, in ways validated by clinical studies published in 2016. Plantain leaf, the broadleaf weed growing in every cracked sidewalk in America right now, was pressed against stings and infected cuts through the documented anti-inflammatory action of its compound aucubin. These were not superstitions. They were observed and repeated treatments, effective enough to keep families healthy 100 miles from any physician. They were replaced not because better alternatives appeared, but because those alternatives could be patented and the old ones could not. Number 18. Home canning and food preservation at scale. In the fall of 1936, a Missouri farm wife put up over 400 jars of food between Labor Day and first frost alone, with 2 children underfoot, on a wood stove. Those jars were the family's insurance policy against winter hunger. A 10-cent packet of seeds in April became 40 jars of tomatoes by October. Girls learned to operate a water bath canner without supervision by age 10 and a pressure canner by 12. The post-war botulism scare campaign so thoroughly frightened Americans away from home preservation that 2 generations abandoned a skill their grandmothers performed routinely and safely for decades. Properly executed home canning produces food as safe as any factory process, and dramatically better in flavor. What changed was not the safety standard. What changed was who profited from your dependence on the alternative. Number 17. Saving seed from the best plants each season. Your grandfather walked the garden every September with a paper bag and a pencil, stopping at the strongest specimens to collect seed from the most productive plants. Those seeds went into labeled envelopes in the root cellar and back into the ground the following spring. Open-pollinated varieties carried disease resistance, flavor, and adaptation to local soil conditions, built across generations of careful selection. By 1990, corporations had systematically replaced these varieties with patented hybrids, producing sterile second-generation seed. Today, saving seed from a patented variety is a federal offense. A practice 10,000 years old was made illegal because someone calculated the profit available in the dependency that eliminating it created. Here is the part that the agricultural industry and the food processing companies have spent 90 years hoping you would never connect. Every skill on this list was not just useful in isolation. It was part of a complete system that made a family sovereign. The garden fed the root cellar. The root cellar fed the winter. The bones from the winter meals fed the soup pot. The soap from the cooking fat cleaned the kitchen that produced the next season's canning. Nothing was wasted. Everything fed the next step. The system that replaced this, the grocery supply chain, the utility grid, the pharmaceutical distribution network, works magnificently when every link holds. What it cannot do is what your great-grandmother's system did without effort. It cannot function when any single link breaks. Number 16, building shelter from what the forest provides. A child growing near woodland in 1920 knew how to stay alive in it. Lean-to construction, a ridgepole lashed between two trees and layered with pine bough shingles tight enough to shed rain, could be completed by a child in under 2 hours, using only a hatchet and what the forest offered. A debris hut packed densely with dry leaves maintained a temperature 30 degrees above ambient in January. The insulation principle is identical to modern sleeping bags, which trap a layer of still air against the body. Your great-grandfather did not need a sleeping bag. He needed to know which direction the prevailing wind came from and how to build a wall against it. The Boy Scouts taught this through the 1950s. They removed it from their handbook in 1972 and reclassified it as advanced. Number 15, milking a dairy animal and managing what it produced. Before industrial dairy consolidated milk production behind concrete walls, almost every rural family kept a milk animal. A family cow was not a farming choice. She was a living appliance, producing 2 to 4 gallons daily, for which came butter, cream, cheese, and buttermilk. Children milked twice daily without exception, before school and after supper, in every weather condition. The cow did not understand weekends, and the family did not expect one. Post-war health codes and pasteurization requirements made small-scale dairy increasingly difficult to operate legally. By 1970, the family milk cow had nearly disappeared from American life, along with 300 years of daily connection between a family and the animal that sustained it. Number 14, churning butter and pressing fresh cheese. Cream placed in a wooden churn and agitated rhythmically produced butter within 30 minutes. Children learned to hear the moment of change, when liquid cream shifted to the heavier thud of fat clumping through buttermilk. That butter was washed in cold water until all buttermilk was pressed out, then salted and packed into crocks for up to 6 months of root cellar storage. Simple farmer's cheese required only curdling warm milk with a splash of vinegar, draining through cheesecloth, and pressing overnight under a weighted board. These processes ran weekly in every rural household. The children who performed them understood their food in a way no grocery store transparency campaign can replicate, because they built it themselves from start to finish. Number 13, navigating without instruments. The North Star sits permanently above true north because it hangs directly over Earth's rotational axis. Find the outer edge of the Big Dipper's cup. Extend a line 5 times the distance between those two stars, and you arrive at Polaris from anywhere in the northern hemisphere on any clear night, without any equipment whatsoever. By day, a stick driven into level ground produces a shadow tip that moves west to east as the sun travels. Mark the first tip. Wait 15 minutes. Mark the second. A line between them runs east to west. A perpendicular line runs north to south. This knowledge worked anywhere on Earth without manufactured tools, and was considered so fundamental that a child who lacked it was regarded as genuinely unprepared for the world they were living in. Number 12, rendering fat and wasting nothing from an animal. When a frontier family butchered a hog, nothing left the farmstead unused. The liver went to the skillet that evening. The intestines became sausage casings. The feet were pickled. The head became head cheese. The skin fried into cracklings. The leaf fat around the kidneys was rendered slowly in a heavy pot, over low heat, into lard so pale and neutral, it disappeared into whatever it cooked. That lard went into pie crusts, biscuits, candles, soap, and boot waterproofing simultaneously. One animal produced the equivalent of a hardware store and a kitchen supply shop combined. Children participated in butchering day from the time they were old enough to be useful. Nobody refused because the alternative was hunger, and every person in that barn on that November morning understood it clearly. Number 11. Making soap from kitchen waste and wood ash. Your great-grandmother's soap cost nothing to produce. Cooking fat, saved in a tin can. Hardwood ash, collected in a barrel with a hole bored through the bottom. Rainwater poured through the ash dripped out below. As live water, tested by floating a raw egg until the correct quarter-size surface showed above the liquid. Combined with render fat in an iron kettle and stirred until trace appeared, poured into wooden molds, and cured for 6 weeks. This soap retained the glycerin that commercial manufacturers strip out and sell separately to cosmetics companies, which is why it left skin softer than anything available at the drugstore. Every rural child watched this process annually. Most could produce a complete batch by age 12 without being told what to do. Number 10. Finding and purifying water from the landscape. A child who could not find water was a child in immediate danger. Moving water is safer than still. Cottonwood trees in a dry valley indicate a water table within 30 feet of the surface. The darkest green vegetation in a dry August landscape marks hidden moisture below. Once found, boiling at a full rolling minute kills every biological pathogen present. The slow sand filter, gravel, and clean sand to which water percolates slowly allows naturally occurring biological action to remove pathogens without chemicals or electricity. FEMA published construction plans for this exact system as recently as 1989. It works on the same principle it worked on in 1820. The knowledge is documented. The practice has ceased to exist in ordinary American households as completely as if it had never been. Number 9. Basic carpentry and repair without professional help. A rural child before 1960 knew how to drive a nail straight, use a handsaw to cut a board square, and use a draw knife to peel a sapling into a fence post. Farmsteads required constant maintenance. That was never contracted out. Fences broke. Barn doors warped. Porch boards rotted. All of it was handled on Saturday afternoon with whatever tools the barn held and whatever lumber remained from the last project. Children handed tools and held boards until they could work alone. The result was a generation that could build almost anything it needed and fix almost anything it owned. We traded that capability for a replacement culture, where the broken thing is waste and the new thing arrives in a box from a factory no one can name. Number 8. Reading animal tracks and sign in the landscape. A child growing near any woodland in America before 1950 read the ground the way a modern child reads a screen. The cloven hoof print of a white-tailed deer, pressed in creek bank mud. The 5-toed drag trail of a muskrat near the water's edge. The scratch marks of a black bear against a beech tree where it stood to mark its height. Children learned these signs by walking beside adults who explained what they were seeing while they moved through the landscape. A hunter who could read these signs knew where deer bedded on cold mornings and which trails rabbits ran before dawn. Fathers taught it to sons starting at age 5 and considered it as fundamental as arithmetic. It required attention and someone willing to teach attention. Both have nearly vanished. Number 7. Making functional rope from plant fiber. The reverse wrap is older than civilization. 2 bundles of natural fiber, twisted individually in one direction, and then wrapped around each other in the opposite, lock under tension and will not unravel under load. Stinging nettle stems, dried and stripped of their sting, yielded inner fibers stronger than cotton rope of the same diameter. Inner basswood bark, peeled in long strips and soaked to loosen the fiber, produced cordage fine enough for fishing line and strong enough for a harness repair. Cattail leaves, milkweed stem, and dogbane provided raw material from any hedge or riverbank. Every rural child could produce functional rope from scratch. The basic twist took 30 minutes to learn. It is now entirely absent from standard American education. Number 6. Preserving eggs through winter without refrigeration. Hens slow or stop laying when daylight shortens. A family without a solution went without eggs from November through February. Water glass, sodium silicate dissolved in water, at a ratio of 1 part concentrate to 9 parts water, sealed the porous egg shell against air and bacteria. When fresh unwashed eggs were submerged in a stone crock and stored in a cool cellar, eggs preserved this way remained viable for 6 to 9 months. A family that put down 200 eggs in October had breakfast through April without buying a single one. The USDA recommended this method in preservation guides through the 1940s, then quietly stopped mentioning it as refrigerator manufacturers began advertising in the post-war market. The method works today exactly as it worked in 1940. Only the knowledge has been removed. Number 5. Baking bread from a living sourdough culture. Before commercial yeast and paper packets, your grandmother kept a ceramic crock of wild yeast culture on the kitchen counter, fed daily with flour and water, alive with the organisms that made her bread rise and her biscuits open. The fermentation conducted broke down phytic acid in the grain, making every loaf more nutritious than anything leavened with commercial yeast. Frontier women carried these starters in covered crocks during months of westward wagon travel. The knowledge of reading a culture's health by smell, consistency, and activity level was transmitted through years of daily proximity to the process. Commercial yeast made it convenient to skip all of that. Within 2 generations, most Americans could not bake bread without a packet, from a supply chain that requires a functioning distribution network to deliver it. Number 4. Treating wounds with what nature provided. When a child cut a hand on a piece of tin in 1890, there was no urgent care center. There was a mother and the skills she carried. Apple cider vinegar, diluted to clean the wound, lowering pH to inhibit bacterial growth. Raw honey, packed into the clean cut, where its low water content and acidic chemistry create conditions bacteria cannot survive. The FDA approved medical-grade honey for wound treatment in 2007, and hospitals now use it on burn wounds and surgical sites. Plantain leaf, crushed and pressed against a sting or splinter, reduce inflammation through documented active compounds. A warm bread poultice drew infection to the surface of an abscess through warmth-assisted increase in local blood flow. Children watch these treatments applied throughout their childhood and learn what to reach for, what to prepare, and how long to leave it in place. Number 3. Fermentation as the foundation of winter survival. Sauerkraut was not a culinary preference in frontier and Depression-era households. It was a medical necessity. Fermented cabbage retains enough vitamin C through months of cold storage to prevent scurvy through the darkest winter months. The lactobacillus bacteria conducting the fermentation produce lactic acid that both preserves a vegetable and create populations of beneficial organisms, supporting gut health in ways the modern probiotic industry now charges $30 a month to replicate in capsule form. Families fermented beets, turnips, green beans, and wild berries using the same principle. Apple scraps became vinegar that preserved other foods, cleaned wounds, and cut grease from cast iron. These processes ran on nothing beyond a clean crock and the ability to recognize the smell of healthy fermentation, which every child knew by age 6. Number 2, treating every drop of water as labor that deserved a second use. A family that hauled every gallon from a well understood the cost of water in a way that turning a faucet never teaches. Dish water washed the kitchen floor. Bath water moved through the family from cleanest to dirtiest and then went to the garden. Cooking water from boiled potatoes thickened the next pot of gravy without additional flour. Rainwater caught under the downspouts watered the kitchen garden, and filtered through sand and charcoal provided drinking water for the livestock. Nothing left the household until it served every function it could serve. This was not environmental philosophy. It was arithmetic. Every gallon had cost physical labor produce, and wasting it was identical to wasting the labor of whoever produced it. Number 1, knowing your food before it reached the kitchen. Every other skill on this list exists in service of this single one. Frontier families understood the complete chain, from soil to plate, without a label or a certification to explain it to them. They knew which potato variety kept the longest in the root cellar and which rotted by December. They knew the early signs of fungus moving through a wheat field before it reached the neighboring farm. They knew the smell of milk at the edge of turning and the sight of a canned jar that had lost its seal. They knew how to stretch a soup bone through a week of suppers and a pound of dried beans into 4 days of meals for 6 people. This was not expertise. It was the baseline of adult competence. A frontier woman who lacked it was considered genuinely unprepared for the life she was living. Today, that description fits the majority of the population of the wealthiest nation in human history. Here is the only challenge that matters. Do not try all 25. Try one. Find planting growing a crack in your sidewalk right now, because it is there, whether you can see it or not. Press a crushed leaf against the next insect bite you get. Save the water from your next pot of boiled potatoes and use it to thicken the next gravy you make. Buy a pound of cabbage and a tablespoon of salt and make your first jar of sauerkraut this week. The knowledge your great-grandmother carried was not extraordinary. It was ordinary. It was a baseline of functional American life across 3 centuries of history. The supply chain that replaced it requires electricity, refrigeration, trucks, and an unbroken sequence of dependent events, stretching from farm to factory to warehouse to your door. Every single link in that chain has a failure point. Your great-grandmother did not need any of them. The only question now is whether you learn what she knew before you discover that you need it.